So I'm truly honored and delighted to welcome you to this event, which, as Polly mentioned, is part of the Provost Initiative on Pluralism, Free Inquiry, and Belonging. As you heard, I'm a provost, and I won't ask for a show of hands what a provost is, but instead what I would tell you how I think about being a provost. The provost is the chief academic officer of the university. So that means I'm, with my team members, we are responsible for the entire academic enterprise of Duke University, the teaching, the learning, the research, things like Focus, the libraries, the Nasher, even the Lemur Center, yes, and so on. So an event like this where faculty and students come together to think deeply together and discuss together and learn together as a provost, it doesn't get any better than that. Whether you're already part of the Transformative Ideas program or you're here because you're in Focus program, I hope you're enjoying this evening, and I hope you continue to seek out spaces for interesting intellectual conversation. Everything we do at Duke is built on our ability to engage each other in good faith and with an open mind. With that fundamental idea, my colleagues and I launched the initiative a year ago. The goal was not to have dialogue with different perspectives, but also to teach the skills we need for difficult conversations. Because we're a university, we don't assume that everyone arrives at Duke equipped for these challenges and discussions. Your faculty are willing to invest the time and care to teach you what you need to know, how to take in something new, how to reflect and absorb, and how to respond with an understanding of each person's humanity and value. You can see the urgency in this project. Just yesterday, of course, a public debate on a college campus in Utah turned violent. And while we may or may not agree with what Charlie Kirk's ideas were all about when he espoused them, I think we can agree that was a horrifying and appalling act. Indeed, it is heartening to see people across the political spectrum, including at Duke University, condemn it. As I mentioned, I believe that a university has a special responsibility to foster dialogue and teach those skills, especially at a moment of polarization. In that spirit, we created the Provost Initiative on Pluralism, Free Inquiry, and Belonging. It's a mouthful, so we call it PFB for short. But each of these concepts is essential, and the whole PFB initiative doesn't work without all of them. Pluralism. Duke is a pluralistic community where people from different backgrounds with different experiences and different ideas come together to learn together and work together. Free inquiry. For learning to happen, everyone, and I mean this, everyone at Duke must be free to pursue their curiosity regardless of where it leads. And belonging, an essential element in PFB. It's only when we feel seen and heard and have a sense that we belong in this pluralistic community, we can truly exercise free inquiry. PFB, if you prefer, is our attempt to address one of the fundamental challenges of our time. How do we coexist in a diverse society? How do we engage authentically across differences? How do we disagree without being disagreeable? The engagement of the faculty, staff, and students in this and other events indicates to me that we're on to something special here at Duke University, and I'm grateful for all of you for being a part of this. Now you are in a treat this evening with Professor David Wong, one of our distinguished professors at Duke, a great scholar, teacher, a great mentor. It's a perfect way to kick off the year for the Transformative Ideas program. Thank you again, Polly Ha, Professor, and your colleagues for putting this event together. Those of you who heard the keynote speaker from last year may remember the words, quote, "Transformative ideas are ideas that have the power to transform the world and transform you," period. I agree. Enjoy your evening, and thank you for coming.
All right, let me start with just talking about what it is for a philosopher to take a comparative perspective. And it's about encounter with another tradition of thought, other than one's home tradition, although what is one's home tradition can be complex. I'll address that a little bit later on. But it's an encounter with another tradition other than one's home tradition of thinking, feeling, and living. And that encounter can present a challenge to us. But if we're open enough and put the work into it, the encounter will generate new ways of thinking, feeling, and living. One comes to understand, even a little, why other people have found their way of life satisfying and meaningful, even if it's different from ours. That understanding can enrich the possibilities for personal growth for ourselves. So much of my work has been comparing the Confucian tradition of philosophical thought with Western philosophical traditions. The seminal figure in the Confucian tradition is Confucius, or so we know him in the West under a kind of Latinized name that Christian scholars gave to him when they traveled to China to study Chinese thought. He went by the name of Kungzi in China. Zi refers to master, and Kung is his family name, Master Kung. The text most closely associated with his teachings is the Analects, which features him in conversation with his students and other prominent people of the time. Now, this was a troubled time in China. People had lost trust and confidence in their leaders and in each other, not unlike our own time. So what Confucius did was to diagnose the problem. And for him, both the problem and the solution lay in relationships. For people to regain trust in their leaders and in each other, the focus had to be on relationships. And these relationships are often structured around social roles: parent, child, siblings, ruler, minister, fellow villager, teacher, student, and friends. And these relationships should, in general, express care for the well-being of others. The word here is ren. In one of its primary meanings, it is care and respect, the Chinese word being here, jing. A good quote to illustrate this belief of Confucius in relationship comes from Analects 5:25. He said, "I would like to bring peace and contentment to the aged, to share relationships of trust and confidence with my friends, and to love and protect the young." So, if we're talking about comparing traditions, this is a pretty significant difference. And I was born in this country. I'm Chinese American. My parents were immigrants from China. And in a way, the whole of my comparative work is very much a personally meaningful project. I'm trying to figure myself out. I grew up with this sense of difference between the culture of my parents and that of mainstream North American culture. And as I say, ever since then, I've been trying to figure it out. Now, relationship is not the most common explanation of the well-lived life in U.S. mainstream culture. Nowadays, having individual rights, including the right to pursue one's own happiness, is a more dominant answer. Yet, the inquiry as to what makes for health and happiness has been found by a study conducted over 80 years in the U.S. And it's surprising, the results. I'm talking about the Harvard study of adult development, a longitudinal study that began in 1938 and is going on through the present. It began with following the lives of Harvard students, including the future president of the United States, John F. Kennedy Jr., but also included young men in the Boston inner city. It came to include the spouses of these men, their children, and later descendants, now totaling more than 1,300 people. The study aimed to find the factors most predictive of the health and well-being of the participants through a whole battery of means, through questionnaires, medical exams, medical lab reports, brain imaging, long-form personal interviews, observations of couple interactions, achievements in education and careers. And guess what? The single most predictive factor turned out to be of good health and happiness. Relationships. Relationships with one's partner, family, and friends. I'm talking here about warm and supportive bonds. One might say bonds of care and respect, harkening back to Confucius. These were the most predictive and powerful factors of the making for happiness and good health. Okay, this is not to denigrate individual rights, but we should ask how we can best use our rights to live the best way we know how to. And so there is reason to inquire into what Confucius thought was involved in achieving good relationships. Now, this is where the ideal of harmony comes in, and you might think, oh, here we're getting a little bit different here. You don't often hear the word harmony here in U.S. mainstream culture, especially lately. He is the Chinese word for it. But right away, we have to recognize that for the Confucians, people who harmonize in relationships don't have to agree all the time. Analects 1536. In striving to be Ren, one should not defer even to one's teacher. Now, previously, I had glossed the meaning of Ren as care. In this context, it takes on a broader meaning of a kind of comprehensive moral excellence. It's the whole package of all the specific admirable virtues a person can have. But here we have the idea that, no, you don't submit to your teacher's views. Confucius, in fact, expected his students to argue with him, to object. And that's the way he learned from his students. Analects 8.8 expresses this expectation of difference and disagreement. The master said, that is Confucius, you can study with some and yet not necessarily walk the same path. Dao, a very important word in Chinese thought. You can walk the same path as some and yet not necessarily take your stand with them. You can take your stand with them and yet not necessarily weigh things up, Chinese word here being qian, in the same way. And we'll talk more about weighing things up and how that becomes a part of how to conduct relationships when things get tough. Okay, well, we didn't have soup this evening, but here's fish soup, actually. And it forms the basis for a metaphor used to talk about harmony. First, a quote from Analects 13:23. The master said, the exemplary person, a person of moral excellence, pursues harmony rather than sameness. Chinese word here being tung for sameness. It's the small person who does the opposite. The small person insists on sameness. but not the exemplary person. So we get to soup in the Zhuo, the commentary of Zhuo, and this is a work of history in ancient China, and it records the words of Minister Yan Ying, who illustrates the difference between sameness and harmony with a metaphor of a soup with meat or fish. The context is that Yan Ying's ruler had complained about his ministers. He wanted more sameness, more chiming in from his ministers. He didn't want all of these objections and reservations raised. So Yan Ying said, well, think of it this way. Think about a soup where the main ingredient might be meat or fish. But to have a good soup, you need to balance those strong flavors and mingle them with other contrasting and complementing flavors. Vinegar, let's say, sauce, salt, and plum. The ruler, surrounded by ministers who only seek sameness with him, is like the chef who adds more water to an overly watery soup. So ministers should balance sameness with difference by pointing out to the ruler what is wrong with the ruler's view, as well as with whatever is right. So agreement doesn't have to underwrite relationships. Some measure of agreement, what I've called shared understanding, is usually necessary for harmony. But if agreement on all fundamental values and how we interpret and apply those values, on how we prioritize them in case they conflict with each other, if agreement on all that were necessary to have viable relationships, we would be alone or antagonistic with others. And maybe that's a reason why our contemporary life so often seems increasingly lonely when it is not antagonistic. Too many people insisting on sameness. Okay, so let me relate harmony as a value to the good of relationships. In Confucian thought, one's very identity as a person and the good one pursues as a person, these two things overlap with the identities and the goods of others. That is, who I am is bound up with my relationships with others, and having these relationships is part of my good as an individual, as it is for them. Their relationship to me is part of their good. The paradigm of this kind of interdependence of individuals' identities and their goods is the family. But as we perhaps all know, interests conflict in families. They might especially conflict in families because things can get so fraught in families. We're so close to each other that conflict takes on this added intense dimension. But for Confucians, that's why harmony requires balancing and negotiation in the light of this interdependence I've been talking about between individuals, their identities, and their goods. So, what do? Well, sometimes Confucians thought members have got to split their differences in compromise, or yielding to others that sometimes can be balanced against getting priority for one's interests at other times. A contemporary Confucian philosopher, Steve Angle, has given the example of a married couple who they both have careers, and one of them gets a career offer. It's hard to turn down, but moving the family would mean the partner has to make some kind of sacrifice, perhaps. The opportunities are not there at the place they're going to move to. And so, what's going to happen? Engel has suggested one thing that might be done is to take turns for whose career interests have priority. An example of how one might try to balance conflicting interests within relationship that is at the same time harmonious, but harmony does not mean lack of disagreement. Okay, here's an example from Mencius 5a2. This is another Chinese text. And it's focused on the teachings of a Confucian philosopher who came after Confucius in the classical era, about the 4th century BCE. He was Mengzi, Master Meng, better known in the West as Mencius. He also received a Latinized name from Christian scholars. One of Mencius's exemplars, a person he looked up to, who inspired him with his moral excellence, was Sage King Shun. And Mencius tells a story about Shun to illustrate how one might act in a difficult relationship full of disagreement and conflict. So, the story begins with the time when Shun wanted to get married. But famously, he had a very difficult relationship with his parents. And he knew that they were likely to deny him permission to marry, even though they had no good reason to do so. The relationship had gotten to that point, right? So what did he do? He got married without telling them. So that's surprising, especially if you have a very common image of Confucianism, that children are good sons and daughters. They do what their parents ask, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Mencius said that Shun went ahead and got married anyway because if he had let his parents deny him the most important of human relationships, it would have embittered him toward them. So, if Shun had conformed to his parents' wishes, he would have lost the marriage relationship. But he would also have done the most harm to his relationship with his parents. Therefore, he got married for the sake of both those relationships, the marriage relationship and relationship with his parents. Okay, I'm not saying he had a lot of repair work to be done after this happened, after he got married, but he was famously a good son who was good at figuring out things. So, what he did was to balance conflicting interests within his family. And Mencius used this story to illustrate the necessity for good judgment that balances the interests of the individuals involved. This is the Chen I was referring to earlier. A satisfactory mutual adjustment of the interests of individuals cannot be specified ahead of time independently of the specific interests at stake and the future nature of the relationships of all the parties. One has to balance, weigh up the interests of goods of the individuals involved in the specific situation. For example, had less been at stake for Shun, or had his parents better reason to deny him permission, it might not have been right, appropriate to the situation, for him to avoid asking for permission and get married anyway. It all depends on the situation. Okay. So this is a little bit about relationships. what kind of a good it is, a supreme good it is for the Confucian, but how bringing relationships off is a lot more complex than one might think. Here I want to say that harmony, as I've characterized it so far, is not simply an Asian value. Across the world, people acknowledge the interdependence of a person's identity and goods with the identity and goods of others. So let's use the soup metaphor, right? But this time the global cultural soup. And within this soup, there are some cultures that emphasize relationship and interdependence as values. There are other cultures that emphasize independence and individual rights. But in any culture, these ingredients are typically mixed in varying degrees of emphasis. So this philosopher, Chen-Yang Li, argued for the resonance between the relationally oriented Confucian ethic of Ren and care ethics that have been associated with women in the US, as articulated first by Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. And Gilligan and Noddings explicitly contrasted the kind of emphasis that's placed in the care ethic on relationships. And the comparison case was an ethic of rights and justice. But she was talking about the US. She was talking about moral reasoning in the US. And Gilligan had thought that women as a group tended more to the care ethic. Now, that's going to be debated within ethics courses. It is in mine. But it's an illustration of how there is more complexity in these contrasts that we're tempted to draw between different cultures. It's not that typically cultures lack entirely a value that other cultures have. It's that there are differences in what's foregrounded in the culture and what's backgrounded in the culture. And moreover, it can change over time, right? There have been times in U.S. history where relationship and community have been much more important than they appear to be now. And not coincidentally, it arose at times of challenge to American society. The Second World War was a time when relationship and community took a far greater place in the foreground. Okay. Here's another study by cultural psychologists Rose Marcus and Elena Connor. And in that study, they point to the presence and variation in proportion of both ingredients, the value of interdependence and the value of independence in men and women, between different socioeconomic classes, races, and ethnicities, and regions of even a single country, such as the US. In the US, however, speaking in generalities, independence has held the cultural upper hand lately, whereas Confucianism has long held that our human strength lies in our ability to depend on each other. But what I'm trying to get across is that cultural differences are typically matters of emphasis like this, rather than stark contrasts. All right, so a bit more about how people cope with differences within their relationships. Across the world, family members and friends love each other, but they disagree with each other, sometimes quite vigorously. Their affinities with each other, their agreements, their shared projects on some matters can form the context in which their vigorous disagreements do not threaten the bonds between them. So in my own work, I've called accommodation that dimension of harmony that strives for constructive relationship in the face of continuing disagreement. We still disagree, but strive to maintain constructive relationship with one another. There are different ways we can implement accommodation, different facets of this value. Openness and preparedness to expand one's conception of the good and of the right upon further understanding and appreciation of other ways of life. A willingness to act on one's own moral positions in ways that minimize or reduce potential damage to one's broader relationship to others who have opposed positions. Sometimes you can crush the other side, but you choose not to because you know it's going to damage the broader relationship you have with the other side. Or there is, as I referred to earlier, a willingness to at least sometimes compromise on what one might have achieved in realizing one's moral position for the sake of sustaining that broader relationship with disagreeing others. So to make a clarification, it's not that accommodation must always take precedence over the moral commitments that are the source of our moral disagreements. Right? But if we always insist that it's my way or the highway, again, we would soon be very alone and left without potential allies in another fight we want to carry on in the future. All right, so interdependence, harmony, these are things that I've talked about in terms of relationships, but I also want to talk about them in terms of knowledge inquiry. Confucians believe that we depend on each other for whatever knowledge we can get about how to live well. But in fact, isn't this generally true? Can you think of important knowledge that you don't know firsthand, that you pull out of your own head without depending on anyone else? Or are most important forms of knowledge things that we achieve by interacting with others, by learning from them, by trusting them that, for example, they have performed the experiment in a rightful way, so that the conclusions are reliable, right? Most of our knowledge is a cooperative product, right? And depends on trust. And again, we're having problems with that lately, right? And this should lead us to examine how we can restore the situation. All right, so to go back to the moral inquiry about how to live one's life that we see depicted in the Analects. The scholar Amy Oberding has argued persuasively that Confucius and his students, as depicted in the Analects, have a method of inquiry that she calls exemplarist. That is, it is based on studies of exemplars, like Shun, Sage King Shun, was for Mencius, right? These people who inspire us and provoke in us the desire to know what it is about these exemplary persons that makes them excellent. Okay. And in thinking with Confucius and his students, as I urge that my students do when we go through the Analects, we too might reflect on the people we have admired and try to identify what is excellent about them. Okay. So, in a Chinese philosophy course, you're liable to talk more about people as sources of moral inspiration and knowledge. In Western philosophy, there's much more focus on principles. That's not to say that you can't get principles from the study of exemplars, you can ask how it is that they act, right? And maybe they act in patterns in such a way that we can formulate into principles, right? But what I love about Chinese philosophy is that it begins very concretely with people who move us and stimulate the desire to in some way be like them. You may not be exactly like them, it may not be possible because we're all different, but we seek inspiration from them and then adapt it to our own situations. And this is what Confucius and his students seem to be doing in the Analects. So, back to what exemplarist epistemology, exemplarist theory of knowledge implies. Any theory about the nature of excellence has got to be earned from reflecting on your experience of those exemplars and sorting through what can be complex reactions to our holistic impressions of who they are and what they do. I can name influential figures in my own life. I can name a professor when I was an undergraduate who I had enormous respect for because he talked about how he lived those values that he philosophized about. He came from the South. He was a civil rights activist, and I could see how his moral ideas were lived by him and rose from his experience. So, in the Analects, Confucius and students talk about exemplars and what they can learn from them. But again, they don't necessarily agree. They engage in dialogue over differences between their reactions to people, as occurs several times in the Analects. They disagree, sometimes emphatically, over who is morally excellent and why. One of the enormous strengths of Chinese philosophy is that it not only calls us to be responsive to our life experience, but also to own up to our responsibility for that experience, because we are the authors of that experience, more than we usually suspect. We don't just passively observe, we interpret, and we bring to the interpretation a host of what we have learned from the past, as well as our biases and our wisdom. And this brings me to the importance of the virtue of epistemic humility. In Analects 2:17, Confucius told his student Zulu that to know when you know something and to know when you don't know, that's knowledge. And the second part is as important, maybe at least as important as the first. Right? And it requires a kind of self-critical attitude and openness, both to oftentimes a slim amount of evidence that we can give for our views, but also to other points of view that people have. Here's another example of epistemic humility in the Analects. In 5.9, Confucius challenges his very judgmental student, Zhigung. He's always criticizing other people. And he asks Zhigung, well, who do you think is superior, you or Hui? And here we're talking about Yan Hui. And Zhigung says he dares not to even gaze up at Hui. Confucius says, yes, you do not come up to him. You had to know that Confucius was cutting Zhigung down a couple of notches for his arrogance and judgmentalism by asking himself to compare with Yan Hui, himself with Yan Hui. And the context here is that Yan Hui was the student for whom Confucius had the highest hopes. But his death as a young man and Confucius' reaction of intense grieving is a major event recorded in the Annex. Confucius did not achieve his ambitions of becoming a high-ranking advisor to a powerful ruler of a Chinese state. And so it's reasonable to assume that when Yan Hui was alive, he held hopes that Yan Hui would be the one to bring the Tao back to China. So at the beginning of this talk, I invite you to consider that learning about other traditions can open us to new ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Doing so can prompt us to consider what assumptions we have about what is a valuable way to live and about what the world is like. Often we don't know what deep assumptions we are making until we encounter other alternatives to those assumptions. So, to go over what we might learn from Confucianism, the supreme value placed on relationships of care and respect. And I've emphasized that this is not a value unique to Confucianism. Even in the US, arguably the most individualistic culture in the world, we here recognize the value of relationship, but it's often in the background of the conversation. One reason it may be time to foreground relationship is our current social and political state. A state of trust in our institutions and each other is low and getting lower. Epistemic and accommodation to differences. These are things that we might take from Confucianism as being necessary to harmony. Confucianism tells us we cannot expect thinking and feeling individuals to simply follow in line behind wise and great leaders. If leaders are truly wise and great, they will be keenly aware of what they don't know and will draw from different life experiences and the viewpoints of those they lead. Difficult moral choices are not between good and evil, but between good and good. And people will differ as to how to balance multiple goods in this specific situation. These differences should be discussed because difficult choices often require sacrifice from those who follow. We've got to keep an eye on what holds the community together in the long run, which means that in our own view cannot triumph every time we believe ourselves to be right. One more distinctive feature of Confucian ethics I want to introduce to answer the above question, building a culture. How do we build a culture and people are more likely to act on these Confucian values? And this is a view about the nature of human persons in whom thinking, feeling, and acting are intertwined. Confucianism views us as embodied beings. It means that if we want to be open to others whose life experiences and ways of finding meaning in the world differ from our own, we must find occasions to meet and interact with them on a regular basis. And these ways of interacting with others constitute a social infrastructure which the Confucians called li, which can be translated as ritual. These are ways of doing things with others that are products of culture. So, there are ways of greeting each other, taking meals with them, ways to mark the birth of a child, to attain the status of a young adult ready to take on responsibilities in the community, ways to get married, to bury and mourn a family member who has died, ways to greet a guest who has come to our home, ways to receive diplomats from other countries or other Chinese states in Confucius' time. These are customary ways that give us scripts, that give us an idea of how we're supposed to conduct ourselves on these occasions, what attitudes we are supposed to express towards others. University life, as you all find, is full of rituals, right? Rituals of going to class, rituals that you enact in the dorm room, rituals of graduation, of course, looking forward, So, in Analects 12.2, Confucius, in explaining the quality of Ren, or moral excellence, said that when you go out your front gate, behave as if you were receiving an honored guest, meaning that you treat each person with respect and dignity. But that's not just an idea. It's an attitude to be practiced, embodied, and lived in actual interactions with others. Doesn't mean, again, that you will not have plenty to disagree with others outside your front gate, but it means that you build the basis for a constructive relationship with these others, even when you disagree, for an accommodating harmony with others. Rituals performed faithfully and regularly constitute a kind of social infrastructure that hold up our ability to work together in the face of disagreement. Chen-Yang Li has a very useful way of thinking about the function of ritual for Confucians. He calls it a cultural grammar ritual. Think about it. A grammar is what allows us to string words together to form meaningful sentences and phrases. It's what we need to make sense to each other when we use a language. Just as we learn our first language through a combination of osmosis and observing others speak and communicate, together with some formal instruction, we learn the ritual scripts our culture provides us to communicate our attitudes towards them and how we propose to relate to them. But they're like the water we fish swim in. We don't realize that they're there until we enter another culture and we are not sure what to do and how to relate to each other. So for Confucius, this is how we become persons and not just a particular kind of biological organism. We learn how to interact with each other and form bonds with each other. A popular way of explaining the meaning of the character for Ren as moral excellence is to point out that it's composed of the character for person and the word for two. And when you put the two together, you get the word for moral excellence. This in turn is explained as meaning that to have a person, you must have at least two of them. We become morally excellent persons only when we learn to relate to one another. We learn as feeling and embodied persons acting in the world, interacting with others, not just thinking persons. So our task is to become multilingual in a society like this, a society made of people who bring different cultural grammars, different rituals. It is a source of great creativity and freedom, you might say, if we make room for it, but also a potential source of great conflict, because we human beings tend to square off into tribal in-groups and out-groups. Fortunately, we have the capacity to learn and translate other people's languages to learn one another's grammars. Languages transform as the people who speak them interact with each other and desire to communicate. We pick up words and concepts from each other's languages. So there's a potential here for a common cultural grammar of care and respect that can coexist with our differences. So I end with this wish for you at the beginning of university, is that you use this space of the university to encounter one another in your multidimensionality as human beings. Your studies, I know, faculty tend to overestimate the magnitude of studies in your total experience. That'll just be one dimension of your experience here. But I've tried to give you a glimpse of how what we study can help us make sense of so much else that you will be experiencing. And I wish you that kind of synergy and joy and excitement that come with it. Thanks.